Hey guys, it's Sandro here, and today's video is a direct comparison and review of 3 car paint finishing polishes, including Sonax Perfect Finish, 3D ACA 520, and NV Finesse polish. A car polish in its truest sense or definition is a light or mild compound primarily focused on removing light to moderate paint defects, such as swirls and fine scratches, light oxidation, mild water spots, and also importantly used to remove compounding haze, holograms, and micromarring that are usually caused in an initial compounding cutting stage to remove more severe paint defects. In other words, these fine polishes are really focused around giving car paint that isn't too bad a nice single stage like correction, or perhaps even more so used as a secondary or final polishing stage after heavier correction stages to restore gloss and clarity to a greater level. The car polishes in this review will be judged in 3 important areas, including their user experience, their defect removal ability, and most importantly, their ability to produce a clean and clear, high gloss finish on various automotive paints. So let's get to it. As always guys, this whole review and my findings will be based around a whole multitude of testing on various hard, medium and soft car paints, using a variety of car polishes, pads and techniques in both indoor and outdoor environments, to gather as much helpful, objective and useful information about these polishes as possible. And the footage you're going to see is just a small portion of the testing that took place. First up is the user experience. So for now, I don't want to focus too much on the results these polishes produce, but more so what they like to work with. But when exploring these car polishes in both mild and more extreme conditions, this is what I discovered. Starting with the wipe off, I think it's fair to say that 3D 520 does have a little more grip than the other 2 polishes and also seems to take several more swipes to completely remove its residue from the panel section. I don't think it's horrible in this area, but I also believe it could be a little nicer and quicker for a finer polish. I really had no issues with the wipe off when it came to Sonax Perfect Finish. I think it was generally quite easy to wipe as far as fine car polishes go broadly, so I really think it would sit in the middle here and just be relatively nice in this area. NV Finesse was clearly the quickest and easiest polish here to wipe down, with very little friction and time needed. I think a part of that was the fact that there was also less visually opaque residue to remove in its section compared to the other 2 polishes. Maybe Finesse breaks down a little further and maybe it gets gathered back up in the pads a little more, but in any case, it's quite a super nice, easy and pleasurable wipe off. Next up was the dusting potential of these polishes. Starting with 3D 520, I have to say that this is a polish that resists dusting extremely well even when pushed. Can it dust? Absolutely, but in comparison to the other 2, it does a better job unless you're pushing it way too far. So dusting really shouldn't be an issue. Sonax Perfect Finish, like 3D, was also quite good in this area. I did notice a few more specks of dust by comparison when I did try to make all these 3 polishes dust, but I also think that dusting really isn't an issue here with Perfect Finish in most circumstances. By comparison, NV Finesse, when pushed, did create the most dust in this testing. And when you start to get a little more aggressive and polish for extended periods, it is the polish here that will break down and begin dusting more rapidly than the other 2. But in saying that, it's certainly no dust storm, and once you understand that Finesse has a quicker and shorter polishing cycle, it's certainly manageable or even avoidable with good technique. Another important user characteristic is residue buildup and removal of pads. A large part of this testing was evaluating how quickly the foam, wool and microfiber pads became overloaded with residue after repeated use, and how easily they were to brush or blow out. An area I thought 3D 520 did very well was resisting clogging up the pads. When inspecting all the pads, the ones with 3D 520 generally took the longest to clog up and get overloaded, and I think part of that was the fact that more of the residue tends to stay on the panel, which is probably also why 3D had the worst wipe off. When using compressed air, the 3D polish also seems to blow out quite well. However, I had next to no success trying to brush it out as the residue just stayed really wet and just wouldn't come off. It really became quite obvious that Sonax Perfect Finish was clogging up the pads far quicker than the other two polishes, and was also much harder to blow out as the residue just seemed to resist coming off the pads. It was a little easier to brush out compared to 3D once it started to dry up a little on the pads, but overall I just found that I had to switch to cleaner pads more often when using Perfect Finish. MV Finesse sat in the middle here as far as clogging up the pads, doing so a touch quicker than 3D but not as quickly as Perfect Finish. However, when it came to both blowing and brushing out the pads, there's just no denying that the residue was released from the pads far more easily and effectively with MV Finesse. I tried giving all three polishes a good workout in direct sunlight, though it was winter here at the moment, so it's not like it was blistering hot weather. In any case, what I found was that you can use all three polishes successfully outdoors, though within reason, as finer polishes are generally much nicer to use compared to heavier compounds, so it's definitely doable. But overall, I did notice that the wipe off with 3D 520 did get a little more stickier and more time consuming, but it still surprisingly resisted dusting. While I also noticed that MV Finesse was still nice to wipe off, but it did dust a touch more in direct sunlight. So although Sonax Perfect Finish wasn't the easiest to wipe off or the least dusting, it did however find a good balance of the two and may be a good choice in that environment. Next up was assessing these polishes' ability to resist sling. Honestly guys, I really didn't see this as an issue with any one of these polishes, as mess and product sling really wasn't something I experienced to any extreme level even while on rotary use. But when I did try to get these polishes to sling and splatter, I found that 3D 520 was a little more prone to it when pushed, while Sonax Perfect Finish sat in the middle and MV Finesse with its thicker consistency really resisted sling quite well. But like I mentioned, I don't think this is a real issue across the board. Lastly, I wanted to discuss the work time and cycling characteristics of these polishes. This is an area that isn't necessarily better or worse, just more so highlights how each of these polishes work a little differently and how you may need to adjust your technique to get the most out of them. I'll elaborate more on this once we get to assessing the cut and finish, but I think this is really important information. 3D 520 has without a doubt a very long potential work time that's further aided by very good lubrication and an almost resistance to breaking down. What this means is that it does seem to be more suited to longer polishing cycles and even using a bit more aggression to obtain the best cut, finish, and even user experience. I'd even say that it has a tendency to rotary use in that way. But on the flip side, it's also quite a hard polish to read, so you don't get a lot of information visually while you're polishing, as it seems to look fairly consistent from start to finish. MV Finesse just couldn't be more different. It has a shorter potential polishing cycle, and while its lubrication is also extremely good, it's not a polish that responds well to an endless polishing cycle or overly aggressive techniques. So Finesse is actually true to its name and is best used with a little finesse as far as technique goes. Also different is the way that it gives the user experience a lot of information about where it's at during use. It starts out far thicker and more opaque, and as you begin polishing, it then starts to thin out and become more translucent as you progress to almost disappearing off the panel as a sign it's done its job, broken down, and is ready to be wiped off. So it really communicates to the user through visual appearance. Overall, I'd say Sonax Perfect Finish is a little closer to 3D 520 in both its longer potential work time and its more subtle visual communication. I don't think you need to work it as long or be as aggressive as 3D1 to get the best outcome, but it does require a little more time than Finesse and gives you that extra work time if that's something you feel may help your results. So although Sonax is much closer to 3D in its characteristics, it's still perhaps a bit of a middle ground in this area with a bit more flexibility in how you wish to work. To sum up here, in the user experience department, I really don't think there's a clear winner or loser, because all these polishes have stronger and weaker points. If longer working times, no dust, limited pad residue, and the ability to be more aggressive is important to you, then 3D 520 is the winner here. If a super easy wipe off, quick work times, easily blowing out the pads, and being able to read your compound is important, then MV Finesse is the winner. And if you're willing to compromise a little in both the wipe off and dusting and deal with changing to clean pads a little more often, then Sonax Perfect Finish is the winner. The next area of evaluation was assessing the cutting ability of these polishes. One thing I want to point out due to past comments is that every single compound or polish can remove every single defect contained within the clear coat or top layer of paint. So when you see a compound that states it can remove, let's say, 1500 grit sanding marks, it's really not about whether or not it can remove it. It's all about whether it can remove it in an efficient manner. So yes, even the least aggressive polish in the world can in fact remove the coarsest sanding marks, but you'd be there all day doing it, so it's not an effective polish to use in that scenario. And lastly, you need to understand that removing, let's say again, 1500 grit sanding marks from a soft clear coat, fresh paint, or even an older single stage paint is way easier and worlds apart from removing those same sanding marks from a super hard or fully cured high solid clear coat. In fact, it's not even close as to how much harder and how much more work it'll take. All I'm trying to point out here is that the specifics matter, and having one experience with one compound on one paint type means little in the whole realm of variables that come with paint correction. Having said that, this is what I discovered while testing the cutting ability of these polishes on different paint types, with different defects, using a number of different pads, machines, and techniques. One thing I can say about all three of these polishes is that they're not purely superfine polishes with next to no cut, but rather finishing polishes with a little bite to them, meaning that apart from finishing well, they can also deal with some minor defects extremely well. That's also the reason why I chose these three particular polishes for this review. Now on this red panel that does have quite a hard clear coat, you will see that even after several polishing cycles with various foam and microfiber cutting pads, I still wasn't able to remove a decent amount of the moderate defects using any one of these polishes in a timely manner. Why? Because it's an extremely hard clear coat, and even though these polishes do have a little cut to them, it's just not enough to have a significant impact on such a hard paint. I just bring this up because I know a lot of people look at Perfect Finish, 520, and even Finesse as one-step polishes, and although in certain circumstances they can absolutely work well, I just don't personally feel there's enough cut there to put them into that specific one-step category due to their more limited cut. So in my experience, all three are really finer polishes with just a little more bite to them. So then out of these three polishes, which one cuts more and which one cuts less? This was a little tricky for me to get a straightforward answer because quite honestly, I don't think there's all that much in it. But here goes. When I really went for it and completely focused on cut using more product, cutting pads, faster machine speeds, more pressure, and longer polishing cycles with all three polishes, that's when I saw 3D 520 start to push ahead and produce more cut than the other two compounds. Though it's also important to mention that the finish quality was quite poor across the board. When I used a more typical one-step process technique and combination, trying to balance both cut and finish as a method, Sonax Perfect Finish seemed to edge ahead as far as cut goes in those instances, and although it wasn't the best possible finish, it was still quite reasonable. But when I used a more gentle technique, all focused around finishing well with polishing pads, less product, and more gentle quick polishing cycles, MV Finesse did seem to produce more cut in those cases, and of course the finish of the paint across the board was much better, though the cutting ability overall was also less. To sum it up, this is what I found. If you want to go hard and focus more on cut any way possible, 3D 520 will get you there more so than the other two. It's just able to cut more for longer as it resists breaking down. But quite honestly, these are not cutting compounds and I just personally wouldn't use them in that way. I think in the most normal polishing cycles where you're looking for more of a balance of cut, Sonax Perfect Finish is the one here that finds it while not destroying the finish like 3D 520 and without having to use a finishing polish like a cutting compound. There's just no denying that MV Finesse initially cuts faster and finishes quicker than the other two. So in very gentle and quick polishing cycles, it does edge ahead. But it's also important to note that once you get to a certain point, both 3D and Sonax do overtake it in terms of cut. So you'd be much better off doing 2 very quick polishing cycles with Finesse, while you could just do 1 longer polishing set with the other 2 if more cut is what's needed. The last and potentially most important area of assessment is the finishing ability of these polishes. I realize that it would be nice to have great cut, finish, and an amazing user experience with every compound we use, but being that these are primarily finishing polishes, their ability to produce high gloss and great clarity on various paint types is perhaps at the forefront, so let's get to it. Firstly, as I've mentioned, paint type and hardness matters, especially when assessing finishing performance. When testing these polishes on harder clear coats, I can say with great confidence that each and every one of them can finish quite perfectly. And if I was working on hard Euro or American hard paints every day, the finishing ability of these polishes wouldn't be a reason I choose one over the other. It would be their cutting ability and user experience. As on harder paints, they can all finish equally well and still give you quite a bit of pad machine and technique flexibility in getting there. When stepping down to a more medium hardness paint or clear, that's when I started to see a bit more variance. Now I want you guys to understand that you can still finish perfectly on medium or average hardness paints with all 3 polishes, but with 3D 520 in particular, you start to lose that easygoing flexibility and you have to start getting more specific with your technique choice. What I mean by this is that I had to avoid overly soft foam finishing pads, use less polish on the pad, and also start polishing more aggressively with pressure and speed to help break it down and then ease off in a final pass or 2. That's the only way I was able to match the finish I was getting with 3D 520 with the other 2 polishes that I really didn't need to change all that much. As detailers or detailing enthusiasts, we all know that the real test of a great finishing polish is soft car paint. Now I could have shown you a test on this soft panel where 3D 520 finished quite badly. Sonax perfect finish was average at best and MV Finesse was quite outstanding. That was the result I got when I first used all 3 polishes side by side with the same general method and technique, not allowing for individual technique changes that can help produce a better finish with specific polishes. I want these reviews to be as informative, helpful, and objective as possible, so I don't think this was a fair test to display. Instead, I decided to put to work what I've learnt about these 3 individual polishes and tweak my technique with each of them to try and get the best finish, which meant using slightly different techniques with all of them. In a nutshell, what this meant is what I just described earlier on the medium paint. I didn't much change anything with Finesse, but with both 3D and Sonax, I halved the amount of polish with both of them, initially worked their sections with just a little more aggression to assist breaking and smoothing down the abrasives, and then eased off doing a final gentle pass or 2 as a technique. And this actually did quite a lot in producing much better finishes. You'll see in the first set of passes that I used a light foam cutting pad or a 1-step pad that can actually finish perfectly on most paints. So the fact that this pad left so much haze and marring in all sections is a clear sign that this is quite a soft and sensitive paint. The second set of passes with a softer foam finishing pad were far better across the board, but I could also see that although Finesse did quite well, the section with 3D 520 still had more haze and micro marring than I'd like to see, and although perfect finish was better than 3D, it still wasn't all that great. So this comes back to the fact that I think both 3D and Sonax just don't finish all that well with overly soft foam pads, as they can't effectively or consistently break down with those pads. The final polishing set was using a more general polishing foam pad that was a little stiffer than the previous finishing pad. This is an extremely difficult paint to finish absolutely perfect on, and it's even quite hard to avoid wiping swells. But you'll hopefully see that both 3D and Sonax finish much better with much less haze and marring by using a better pad suited to them, and also by adjusting my technique to play better with their finishing ability. Overall guys, though it may be hard to see in the footage, 3D 520 never really finished quite as good as perfect finish on this softer paint, but you know what, it wasn't all that far. And although perfect finish was quite good in terms of gloss and clarity, I still think it's fair to say that Finesse was just a touch better. But once again, with good technique, the difference wasn't exactly huge. I think the bigger difference was just the fact that I never had to try to finish well with Finesse. It just seemed to finish well and isn't too fussy with pad or technique choice. For me, that was the real difference, as given the right combination and technique, all three can in fact finish quite well, generally speaking. So let's wrap up this video. I tried to give you my most objective assessment of these polishes so far, but this will be my more subjective personal opinions. Starting with 3D 520, I really don't mind this polish. I like the fact that it doesn't tend to dust, is hard to overwork, has pretty decent cut, and at least on hard to medium paints it finishes extremely well. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just more that as a finer finishing polish it would be more appealing if it could finish better on softer paints, as well as wipe down a touch easier to also help avoid wiping swirls on those more sensitive paints. In a body shop environment where the perfect finish isn't necessarily top priority, and a finishing polish with a bit more cut, less dusting, and a tendency towards rotary use is more desirable, I can absolutely see it being a winner. But in my world, where I do work on lots of softer car paints and finishing well as possible is my priority, it's just not going to be my number one choice. Sonax as a brand appeared in Australia a decade or so ago, was around for a short time and then disappeared again for another decade and resurfaced again about a year or two ago. Having said that, I have tried and tested Perfect Finish before, but never quite to this level. And I'm glad I gave it a better go this time round because I think it has some really great things going for it. Just like 3D 520, it is lower dusting with great lubrication, decent cut, and with extended polishing cycles if you desire. But unlike 520, it does tend to wipe off easier and importantly, finish a little better overall. I also think for outdoor detailers, it's quite a good polish in that environment. The main cons I experienced was quick clogging pads which are hard to clean out, but if you have a few more pads to start with or work with a pad washer, you can certainly combat that. The other thing would be that if you're a detailer that works on a lot of softer Japanese or perhaps even older sensitive single stage paints, there may be a couple of other finishing polishes out there that are easier to finish well with. The last thing is price. We all live in different parts of the world, but at $129 a litre through Sonax Australia, it feels way overpriced, being almost twice as expensive as most other compounds I use. So it's hard to go there unless there's something it offers I can't find in another polish. And as much as I like it, there's certainly no shortage of great polishes at much lower price points. Coming in at $75 a litre, MV Finesse isn't just the cheapest polish in this review by quite some margin, but also one of the most affordable good compounds here in Australia. And although I realise it may not be quite as recognised worldwide, it's certainly a favourite polish by many here down under. I think its biggest hurdle is the fact that it's easier to overwork and as such tends to dust at least a little in that scenario. You could also point out that in this review it also has a little less cut, especially on those harder paints. And although this isn't a huge difference, it may in fact be more geared towards softer car paints from that standpoint. But as far as being a true high gloss finishing polish even on the most sensitive and challenging paints, aided with an easy wipe off, MV Finesse does excel in those particular areas. From the very first time I tried it a good 5 years ago, I've really come to love this polish and would absolutely hate to see it disappear, as I've just had too many jobs where it's been an absolute lifesaver. No polish has it all, and there's always compromises to be had, which I hope I was able to highlight in this review. And I also hope this video helps point you towards whichever polish here seems to fit your needs best, with a better understanding of what you can expect and how to get the most out of it. I think I'll leave it there, guys, and if you enjoyed this video and would like to say thanks and help support future content, you can do so by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ccad, in which I'll have a link to in the description box, or you can now hit the thanks button below the video. And thank you everyone for the support so far. As always, I really hope you guys enjoyed and found this video useful. Please share it with others, give it a like and comment below to show support for this content, and I'll see you guys soon.